Okay, I think we can start. A little bit of a mental break before we get into the discussion section of this very, very interesting section. Thank you guys, all three of you, for your wonderful presentations. And where are the men on this panel? Just a lame attempt at a joke. I feel like some of my pre-prepared questions were answered during the presentations, but what I want to ask Diana right off, are you sure you're not rewriting history? I know you're not the one writing necessarily, but I think you're not giving yourself quite enough credit with opening up this access.
But it's not, yeah, I mean, do you have more
Go
of a
ahead.
question? Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is I have a problem with this kind of culture of ego-based authorship, which I think is actually quite toxic in the art world. I mean, there's actually someone else in the audience here that I really need to thank, who is Amara Antilla, who's going to be part of the Pechacucha presentations this evening. But, you know, when we talk about conversations, I think, you know, these ideas of how do we rewrite art history, what are these gaps, are things that we discuss among colleagues. And one of the best pieces of advice I got as a young curator was actually from Shuda, and he was saying, surround yourself with people who are generous with their knowledge. And someone else told me, surround yourself with people who are naturally collaborative. And I think those are things that I have really stuck with. So we have this kind of growing family of people who come together. And a lot of these, I guess, something that didn't really come across, or hard to get across in 15 minutes, is some of these best art historical discoveries are actually coming outside of the art systems, right? There's the art world, and there's the work of art. And sometimes they don't come together. So when I was in the Fukuoka Asian Art Museum for 2 months in the archive, I came across the remarkable work of an artist I hadn't heard of, and his name was Ratan Majumdar. So when he was 26, he was exhibiting in all the kind of global, you know, it's like kind of the young Bangladeshi like superstar. He was showing in Fukuoka, he showed at the Whitechapel, he was showing in China, all over the place. But when I asked people in the Bangladeshi art scene where he was, people told me he was dead. He's not dead. He just basically made people, the kind of powerful people in the art world, jealous and upset. He turned to alcoholism and kind of like moved out into a village. But what's amazing about this guy, and again, this connection came through a connection with the work of art, is that he has kept every single catalog of every single exhibition he was ever a part of. So his archive is actually better than that in Fukuoka. He has catalogs of Bangladeshi art in China in 1989. Sadly, this catalog doesn't say where the show was or any details like that, but it's published. But it's kind of having, or even like the example I brought of Syed Jahangir, having these conversations with other people that were able to catalyze results outside of existing systems. I think it's, again, it's stopping thinking about me and it's about thinking about we. I can't talk to Ratan without someone who speaks Bangla. I can't do research on East Pakistan without people who speak Urdu and Bangla. I don't speak either of those languages. It's not my job to write that, but I think it's great to bring these things to people's attention, bring resources because this research needs to be done, and hopefully catalyze a whole new generation of Bangladeshi art historians.
Oh, fantastic. I mean, there's two things happening here. I think gaps are being filled with historical art history, historical positions that were never really written about in the Eurocentric academic system. On your end, you're documenting things that are happening now that will be written about for art history going into the future, because I think this discussion is going to balance both of those things to a certain extent. One question I sent out to you guys before, who's responsible maybe for both ends of this? This is a very shifting thing. White male academics were perhaps responsible for canonizing works in the past, for writing all the books that undergraduates read in our academic institutions. How is responsibility changing? Who's taking responsibility? Who has the agency to take responsibility? You can think about that for a second. Are you guys all taking responsibility?
I mean, I think it's impossible in this day and age for anyone to not take responsibility, to be honest. And I think that's a common thread in the art world, at least in the circles or that we engage in, is that everyone wants to have that conversation. So actually, it's not about having the conversation, really. It's not about being able to speak. It's about how we speak and what are we speaking about. I think, you know, yesterday we touched on this a little bit about something like the binary, which, you know, frankly can be quite problematic actually in terms of taking a conversation further, because we end up just getting caught in these old words that we actually inherited and don't belong to us really, I think, quite frankly. I mean, they're colonial as well in some ways. So I think the conversation is important to overturn these, but this is where we seem to be now. Yeah. Especially in Asia, it just seems so palpable there.
Yeah. How exactly does one do this? Beyond what you're already doing?
I'm thinking of responsibility because I had this experience last month, and I was giving a talk about my work called Occupation, about a city in the West Bank named Al-Khalil, Hebron. And I was amazed that after I gave the talk, and then one ex-Israeli person came to me and said, what you are saying is not correct. And I was shocked first. What, you think I'm not responsible enough to come and give a talk and make my research and say what I think is correct? Why and this experience, I had it often with Israelis that refuse any narrative to be accept their narrative, and often a person will come to me, even actually mainly in France, because the other experience, I had it in Pompidou, in Center Pompidou, with an exhibition that the text is saying about, it's a text with my work called The Valley, you can see it in my website, but a letter that the village people wrote to the Israeli representative of the military regime that was in the till 68, above the Palestinian, and I used this letter in my statement, and then come an Israeli person and telling me, this is not correct, what you are saying about this village. So this, so this is the responsibility of an artist, of course, to have a freedom and imagination, but when bringing the words and the text, I think we're all responsible to have correct information, and if these texts can be exist in the center.
Here's a really big question. What could a new art history look like? Canonization has its own set of issues. We're just talking about a little bit about the responsibility of this, but dream a little bit. What would be the best kind of art history written going forward?
Well, I think at least like from the Bangladesh perspective or even the Bengal perspective is that, this, for example, the Mellon Institute currently has this London Asia project, which is actually quite well funded. And so it's talking about, basically the important role that London played in the development of art in Asia. But there were important moments of inter-Asia exchange. Like teachers in the art school in Bangladesh were going to Japan for their references. Why does London or New York or Paris have to be the center? And I think it's trying to decentralize those narratives. And I think that, I guess a quote I've been using a lot is coming from this Johnny Cash cover of a Nine Inch Nails song that My Empire of Dirt. It's, we really need to challenge these power structures and who built them. And, a lot of it is desire, but what do we desire? I think that's an important way to relook at this.
Sorry, I really agree with you.
Yeah.
So I'm like, oh yeah, because absolutely, I think an ideal art history would actually just be a broader one and a more expanded one. So again, that's why the non-aligned movement, it's something that stays in my mind a lot, because I also think that for me, I would like not to have to be directed by American discourse, actually, in terms of how we talk about culture and culture politics, Anglo-American, however we want to do, Western Europe. Perhaps we need to talk about these definitions too as well. Because, I think that we're dealing with so much right now that's overlapping, cross-hatching. We're all experiencing globalization, We're all experiencing a level of, a level of what it means to have a post-colonial identity. Do you know what I mean? And what does that actually mean today? So, going back to Ibraz and why the practice was important and why that has stuck with me is because I'm interested to see what is emerging. And the only way that we can do that is by looking and listening to artists and people like our peers and everyone else who's actually I feel like everyone is kind of on this road in terms of trying to find how a new art history or a new way of being in the art world can be produced somehow.
I have a quick question. Why did Ibraz end? Just a quick little
I
aside.
can't say that.
Okay.
It's just not important.
Okay.
We had a 5-year period and it was very, very productive. And to be honest with you, it got to a point where we were just we have to stop. We were publishing every month, 2 essays, 2 conversations, 2 projects, reviews. And it was great because there was a real need to have a platform like this at that time. And so we didn't want to say no to anyone. But it meant and we were a small team. I was working 2 days, a day and a half a week. But, we did it because it was important at the time. And once the momentum is there, it just flows. And eventually, I think we all had a burnout.
I wanted to mention or to speak about two things with my own work, which connected to our issue. I choose to work in the invisible, or what we want not to see, or it's there and we are ignoring. Or, for instance, I choose the city Al Khalil because it's a super stereotyped city in Palestine, and all the bad joke about this city. And or another example, I choose to photograph Palestinians who joined the Israeli army to fight against their own people. And they do it because they will build a house, a concrete house, while they are destroying, of course, the homeland. And and to choose to photograph in Germany the Gastarbeiter and the refugees, the ex-police of the Second World War, I think this is also to bring, I feel it's my own responsibility of member of this community or the world, to put the light of issues that they are there and we need to see them, we need to include them. And I choose to go with it one step further, and when I'm making an exhibition, it's very important for me to bring the people I photograph to see it. So when this work, Heimat, was exhibited in Last Documenta, we managed to make 7 tours for the people and the community that I photographed from them with their own language. So Croatian for the Croatian community, or Turkish, or Romanian. And when I photographed in the orphanage in Poland, we made sure the museum to send buses to bring the children from all the orphanage to see the exhibition that's talking about them. And I think this is something that me as an artist, I must take responsibility and do it. And when I photograph in Jordan in a refugee camp and I exhibit the work in Amman, I must take responsibility, make sure that the bus go to the refugee camp and bring the people to see the exhibition that talk about them.
You're exploring actual histories, like forgotten points in history through your art, which will then perhaps be canonized into art history. But yeah, there's a deeper responsibility, and you've been plumbing and researching and going into these gaps. I guess gap is also a word that connects all of the things that we do. Stephanie, you said something about the histories going now just have to be questioning these power structures. What obstacles have all of us, I could even join in on some of this, have we encountered in covering, as journalists or as critics, non-Western positions, dealing with just the apparatus of art publishing? I mean, that's its own thing that nobody's talked about. Or what gets seen, what gets covered. You talked about authorship. This is a big. What are the obstacles to this somewhat idealized conversation that we've been talking about a bit? What have we encountered?
I mean, from the experience of publishing, I can say that when I started, there was no global publication for me, which is why I ended up writing for different regional publications. So I wrote for, I started with Leap in China, Issue, and then, in the end, Zebras and everywhere else. And in the end, and Art Papers, and all of these publications, and Naked Punches in Lahore. So all these publications kind of combined to create a circle that I was able to inhabit the middle ground, which is the global. And actually, I think you said something about the gap. I mean, for me, this comes back to the binary. It's much more interesting to think about what is between these two poles than it is to think about these two poles, actually. And I think that's where a lot of third culture, post-colonial, whatever you want to call it, people, I think that's the space that actually, I think we all inhabit to a certain degree now, if you want to be real. I mean, even if you're just a non-digital native, let's say, there's a hybridity to existence that I think is, yeah.
I think I have an interesting concrete example. So I actually really like this journalist. She's a really nice person and she's very interested. But Amy Sherlock's piece for Freeze on the Dhaka Art Summit was called How to Look at Art from Somewhere Else. But I would say about a third of the piece is about a Hollywood film that she watched on the plane. And like in her defense, I think the editorial timelines to turn around that review were so fast that she couldn't possibly process everything that she saw there. And I think that perhaps it's like, this speed or this demand for fast content to be the first person to publish, you can't actually get into depth. And the piece that upset me the most, which I think is so irresponsible, was Art Asia Pacific wrote this anonymous kind of gossip piece that said Glenn Lowry, the highest paid art professional in the world, goes to comparatively scrappy Dhaka, and it was really, the way it was worded, basically proliferated all of those stereotypes, and it didn't go into the content at all. And if you're a publication that's supposed to be supporting and building solidarities in the region, and you're proliferating these power structures, that's also dangerous. But also on my side, a good learning lesson that perhaps I'm very proud and happy that Glenn Lowry and Maria and all these people came, perhaps they're counterproductive to what I'm trying to do.
How do we get beyond some of these things? No, this idea, I was reading a piece by Christian Cravagna, who we did invite him, and he couldn't come to this conference because he's written quite a lot about transnationally, the transmoderne, the cultural encounters over history, over the past 100 years. But he cites James Elkins, who I talked about in my introduction, and how Elkins thinks there's no possible way we could have a global art history because the academic discipline of art history in itself is Eurocentric, white, male, just the discipline.
It just depends on how you define global.
But it depends on global, and it could be that we need this new art history. But yeah, should we just divest ourselves, regional publications focusing just on the region and somewhat, no?
No, actually, a lot of the regional publications have gone global. So, I mean, Ibraz, when I started, the whole idea was that eventually we wouldn't need the tagline because, the whole idea is that the practice is taken for what it is. And then with Leap as well, recently, they've called themselves the Global Magazine of China because China's also globalizing as well. This is a new world, really, in so many ways that we're navigating. And I also don't feel like, and actually, Mohammed, he shared this interview with Spike Lee today about, what was the name of that movie? The Black Klansman. And so Spike Lee was talking, it was a good interview in the sense that he was saying, there have been white allies that have been, supporting this cause just as much as, there are some of us who are working in very mixed environments where, all of these different registers we have to mediate because it's also become such a big conversation on a top level, do you know what I mean, about culture and race and the binary and all of these things, yeah. So Diana, you were nodding.
No, I agree with you.
Maybe the key is just processing it and having time to, as Martin mentioned earlier today, just taking some time away and letting art history, or letting the main threads get teased out over time. I mean, that takes time anyway. Critics are always trying to name movements and coin post-internet art and things like this, or crapstraction. And actually, minimalism, I think, had about 6 names, and only minimalism stuck after about a decade. So art history takes time as well. There's a time frame.
And that's actually why structures of conversation are so important. So, I mean, with Ibraz and Basel, what I was trying to say was that, the structure is there and it's solid. It depends on what you do with it, so.
I think also, so the course I'm teaching is about reimagining large-scale, perennial exhibition models. There's so much money, I mean, much is relative, but in the region for exhibitions. But I feel like there needs to be a way to tap into this and put it into thinking and put it into other forms. Why does it have to be about the exhibition all the time? And I think what something that we got really good feedback about was bringing these art historians into the summit because they feel like they're actually not normally invited into these kind of exhibitionary platforms. So to create these spaces where academics, artists, practicing curators can come together to think without having something to show is also, I think, a valuable investment. We need to rethink how funds for the arts are used and spent.
Since I'm from the practical side, I'm the one who does, or I have to do it. And I think that was remarkable, that last documenta chose to exhibit the main venue in the north side of Kassel. Usually the north is the rich, but in Kassel the south is the rich, and the north is for where the guest workers living and the poor families. And the documenta chose, it's main venue there in this neighborhood. And I asked Documenta to give me, the office to give me 100 tickets to enter Documenta with free tickets, €0. And I received them to give to the people I work with. And they come, and for the first time, they saw Documenta that exists in their castle, in their city, and with a guided tour to explain what is there. And I think this, for me, this is how we as people who do the work, we need to do it. It's very important, and then everybody must get up and do in the area where one person is exists.
So you bankrupted documentation.
This was argued that it's the income, and they showed me how much the tickets are very important income.
Should we open
But
up?
they are the extra people. They are the extra people, so the income kept from the ticket.
Hands are flying up everywhere. It's time to open the discussion to the audience. Ooh, lots of hands. Marina might have been first. Marina Fokidas in the back.
Hi, thank you very much for all your... I can tell you how we bankrupt Documenta, but before that, I wanted to say, no, it was amazing to hear it to you. But then with this last question, I keep hearing since yesterday, we are talking about history, rewriting history, without putting the plural. And also we are talking about the importance of bringing talks to Art Basel as a solid ground, or by, having an article about something we did in New York Times in the first page or last page. And I think that sometimes or colonial, post-colonial, we are trapped in the question, how can we go beyond that within our own mind and terminology. Basel and New York Times is important only if we give it importance, right? I mean, we just hear Diana saying how difficult I think it must have been, and also bringing people to Dhaka as opposed, like bringing everything from Dhaka out. So I've been thinking that sometimes models of inclusion and exclusion, although they were very somehow important when they were formed and discussed as history, can defeat their own purpose. Like all these efforts to forge a counter discourse to hegemony can become hegemonic themselves. So my question to all of you would be, how can we somehow find back the idea of liberation and self-determination, escaping though from the viewpoint of the author that brings all this together, or not escaping? There is an author. That's one question. Now, going back to what Ahlam said, yes, I mean, with the Documenta 14, the 100 tickets, the main venue in North Castle, but also a whole branch in Athens that had 350,000 people that they wouldn't pay tickets, maybe have created what is after was called deficit. But by now we know, and also after the last news, that the deficit actually, there were no criminal, I mean, as of the day before yesterday, that there was no criminal conduct in using the money, misconduct in using the money of Documenta. The responsibility go back to the politicians, that they didn't raise the budget when they were asked, but having somehow decided for a proposal that was going to be a counter discourse. What I'm trying to say is that we are trapped in categorization, like history or rewriting history, that might not allow us to other solutions. So yeah, I would like, now I made a big speech, but I would like to hear how can we escape in all the situations the viewpoint of the author that puts together the global South or the non-global South, the post-colonial, and how we should stop having not so much the binary between who I am and who are you, because differences should be differences if there is no suspicions, but mostly the binary on region and periphery, and who defines that? Who defines the importance of Art Basel? The money?
Okay, I'll respond to that because, of course, it's Art Basel. So, I mean, I'd say Art Basel and documentary are not very different. And actually, for me, I think history, I don't know if there's an author of history. I wouldn't say I'm an author of history. I would say that perhaps collectively we're an author of history. What? Sorry. Oh, yeah, or histories. But, you know, I mean, when I say history, I mean, I'm presupposing histories, to be honest with you. And when it comes to terminology, I'm quite tired of having to run around in circles chasing tails, trying to redefine or define what post-colonial means. I think that we're in a time when we should all be thinking about what new vocabularies we can use. That's what I'm interested in now.
But this is exactly what I said, not to redefine
But,
what post-colonial
sure.
or history, but to abolish it.
But so the point is,
Terminology matters.
but with the, totally. Well, I mean, in the sense, okay, but I said, so let's say, for example, with Art Basel Talks, the whole rationale behind that is you bring people together whose work resonates with each other. You bring people together who are focusing on similar dynamics, even if on the surface their work doesn't seem so aligned. Sorry?
Who is the audience?
The Hong Kong public. So I'll give you an example with Art Basel in Hong Kong. The tickets, it's pretty amazing actually how the public has responded to this fair. The tickets are sold out and they'll still come and line up. This is how popular the fair has become, because it's one of the main ways that the Hong Kong public is able to gain access to great works of art, actually, because let's be honest, with 250 galleries from all over the world, you're definitely going to see at least one or two good pieces. And then aside from that, the conversations are free. And for us, I think the whole idea with the conversations is we just want to hear people talk. Perhaps in these conversations, and perhaps the more that we talk about these things openly or in different ways, we'll be able to reach certain definitions or something, a new idea of what history could be in the future. But for now, I'm happy to just kind of abide by the fact that we have to deal with these terms. I'm happy for them to exist. But to be honest with you, they exist on a kind of side view, because the main focus is a new kind of opening up in some ways and new vocabulary. So that's...
I guess, Marina, to address the authorship part of your question, I've also kind of seen this problem, and I think that's also, like, what I hope one day is, like, kind of referencing Shuda's presentation, that the Dhaka Art Summit can just be a fossil in someone else's art history. It doesn't have to be, like, this kind of big thing. It was never meant to be, like, a Venice document or any of those kind of things of the region. And so thinking about how our collaborations work, because so basically we invite in a lot of guest curators who we support to do research, and then my exhibition weaves together ideas from theirs. What I realized with our collaboration with Cosmin Kostinas and Parasite was that actually every single staff member in that institution was working on this show. And it was really incredible, from the interns to the assistant curators, and many of them came to Dhaka to install the show. So for the next edition, rather than seeing this as individuals invited in, I'm inviting in institutions across Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, in the hopes that we can think together. But maybe, you know, if the summit stops in 2020, how great if that energy could carry over in Malaysia or Indonesia or, you know, somewhere else. It doesn't, I think when it becomes too defined, that's when it's time to move on.
Clementine, I think, was next, and then Andrew.
Yeah, I would like to ask the panel how they feel about what I call a kind of a market stall approach. I can't speak globally, but I can speak for an experience that began in '92 in Dakar and continues. And I'm disturbed by the absence of investment on the part of historians and writers in the legacies of major artists, say, who have been working on the African continent and whose work is not featured because one isn't really thinking about the value of having a serious, in-depth exhibition, for example, on, looking at Emeka now, on Eraboy Mokpae, on Gani Odutokun, who died in a car crash in the 90s. I'm thinking of the necrophilia that surrounds my friend Issa Sambe, who was only exhibiting 10 years ago because Waziz Diop insisted that he needed to have money, but who was, if you like, resisted the archive hunters. So I think there is an ambivalence and a tension going on at the moment between archive hunting, and this is happening, This is happening with photography. This is happening with conceptual work in non-so-Western parts. Now everybody wants the archive of Issa Samb. Everybody wants the archive of the Laboratoire Agitar. Well, I can tell you that this is a fabrication in many ways. Yeah, and apart from the fact that it would be important to have this trajectory in documentary form, it's questionable if this trajectory should be then owned by the Getty or owned by the Metropolitan or owned by Tate Modern, right? Now, why is it again and again when it comes to new practices on the African continent that this is presented as if you've got vegetables on a market stall, and that again and again there is an absence of in-depth retrospectives of artists who are just about alive, yeah? There are many artists working now who are in their late 60s who still have a body of work that hasn't been eaten by termites, yeah? That hasn't been sold and éparpillé all over the homes of diplomats. And I find it tragic to see that again and again there is a kind of horror vacui with regards to doing large shows with few artists that we might learn more about, which require persistence in the sense of looking at lengthier periods of time at less amounts of work and less amounts of artists. And it's shocking for me that Documenta did this again, showed so many artists from Africa thrown out like marbles from a bag, yeah, and that there was no effort to do any in-depth research into the artists who are passing and who still have testimonials, who still have something to say about global art histories. And I want to ask the panel why this constant horror vacui about the singular artist, be she a woman, you know, Younoussé from Senegal. Where is the trajectory of Younoussé? She's still alive. She did work out of crumbling colonial buildings in the 80s. Yeah? She reconstituted broken down colonial buildings and made works out of that kind of ceramic. Why don't we know about this material? Why is Erabo Emokpae and his early abstract painting from the 60s nowhere to be looked at, nowhere to be read about? Why do you continue to do projects that are based on named groupings of names, as if that was going to constitute, with an additional small title, a worthy art curatorial project? What is this?
I completely agree with you. And I also think that, you know, part of a way to address this, I mean, so I personally take great critique of Tate, as you can see. However, I have to say that the patron of my project is the co-chair of the Tate South Asia Acquisitions Committee. So on the foundation side, which is not, those contributions are personal. They're not from the foundation side. But why is Tate having people from the region pay to drain things out of the region? Why isn't there this desire for people in the region to build institutions like, you know, taking care of archives or showing artists that don't have a brand isn't sexy, but actually I think over time that is what is important and that is what is needed. So at least what I'm trying to do, we're ending the summit, our building is opening, and we want to do more things like this that are about local artists. It's not about being an international feeding ground for this kind of biennialization. Like, I think that, you know, that's dangerous, and we need to slow down. We need to do more in-depth research. These founders, these people who are mentioning, these artists working in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, some of them are still alive. And it's really important and timely. They're the carriers of that history. That history, especially of that East Pakistan period, isn't really written anywhere. Or if you're a researcher and you don't know that some Bangladeshi artists changed the spelling of their name in solidarity with the language movement, and you go to the Asia Art Archive, you won't actually be able to see the story because you have to look up several spellings of the names. So, you know, it's complicated, but I agree that that's the way things need to go. But it's also about local institution building. And like Marina said, Tate's important because we give it importance. Can we make other nodes of power?
Does anyone else want to try to answer this? I could add a couple of things. It's the neoliberal system. I'm speaking just as a writer who works a lot for the mainstream press. And these kinds of things scare those people. It's hard to sell stories on this stuff. I'm not somebody who will do long scholarly research. Sometimes I head that direction. And I fully agree with you, and it's shocking what gets blocked by the publishing gatekeepers, or even what gets edited out once you've written a piece. And that has to do with sales, advertising, in terms of exhibition making, which I do not do. I know that plenty of people need those sexy names to get the funding. It's just part of the power structures that Stephanie was mentioning. And it's tragic. And then there's the flip side to this. You see all of the kind of older white women that are suddenly getting retrospectives everywhere. Maria Lasnik died a few years ago, but she just got her show right before she was dying. The minute these people are exposed, there's a market rush on them. Also not a great situation. So, yeah. Okay.
I think that it's exactly as you say, but I want to somehow defend a little bit this version. I mean, not the Documenta as an institution, and it's not me that I invited this over 15 or 16, I don't know, artists from different countries from Africa, because
But they were really happy to participate in the
Yeah,
exhibition.
they were not-
So
and I want
why,
to say-
in order to
No,
think
just
something, you have to
yeah.
delete,
I want to say that-
the others?
Yeah, totally.
They were not young artists. Yeah, most of them, they were not young artists, of what I know. They were not artists that they were discovered in archive. Let's say Makoba, yes, but you know, we haven't seen his work. And I think that asking to see works that come from specific regions, in a certain kind of context, of course, you cannot please everyone that it's somehow specialist in different countries in Africa, but this is what I was trying to say before about escaping the viewpoint of author that wants to bring things together. You know, I think that asking to see specifically the artists that they come from African places, countries together in a certain kind of context, while not asking the same for other artists, maybe bring us back to what Olu was saying back in 94, that this kind of association that people put upon African artists and this kind of primitivism they see is an issue of race. So what I wanted to say, just to bring some names, Abubakar Fofana from Mali, a kind of an indigo master and an artist, or Igo Diarra, also from Mali, bringing his institution, or many other artists. I mean, they are not really artists that they're branded by galleries, represented by galleries, names that they go around, and they are not, their work was not sold in an African, on quote marks, context, or neither art historical nor kind of regional, because that's not what we felt we had to do.
I mean, actually, Ahlam, I think you made a really good point. I think actually you can, it's not either or sometimes. It can be all of it together at once, I guess is what you were trying to say.
I'm sorry, but I have a feeling that what's happening here, it's in order to have a new words, we have to delete the words before, or if I didn't mistake, there was like a question to delete the author. I want to be a woman. When I exhibit my work, I want to be from Palestine, and I insist to keep them. I don't want to delete them. And yes, my narrative coming from my position as a woman, struggling in this world, this patriarchal world, and as a Palestinian, that my narrative is deleted and not allowed to exhibit. So I'm very proud to be in Documenta and 1 million people to hear my Palestinian narrative. I want it. I want the Biennale that offer place to young artists to exhibit their work. We must, I think, I enjoy to have it. I enjoy to go to the Biennale and to see new generation exhibit their work. But I'm hearing here all the time, we need to kill the Biennale.
No, I mean, I think you're right. I think that we need to be, and I think that this is a big issue actually, and what I was trying to talk about a little bit was that we need to find a space where we're allowed to be what we want to be actually, and where people can be who they want to be, they can assert what they want to assert, and we're able to take it in. We can have an interesting conversation, perhaps a debate. It doesn't have to end up in war. You know, we could actually perhaps transcend the where we are and to a place where everything is actually able to be included in a conversation, perhaps. And there's no kind of accusations, you know.
Or maybe I from this third world arrived the party, but the party is ending. So maybe what I'm saying, it's an old-fashioned. Okay, I'm not so
Yeah.
smart. But yeah, my feeling, maybe you are leaving the party.
No,
but
no,
you
not
just arrived to celebrate.
But there's going to be a new party.
And it actually makes,
That's good.
and it
Maybe
makes
the after party.
Yeah.
It's always better than the party.
Now we want the heart.
I think it's interesting also because, you know, there are we don't all have to assert our identities. Do you know what I mean? Like, identity doesn't have to be the be-all and end-all of every measure that we judge an artwork or an art exhibition or our practices. You know, like for me, I'm you know, like you, I'm a product of colonization. The only way that I can understand myself is that I was authored from history. Like, my father was a British colonial police force. My mother was basically some woman who ended up in Hong Kong because of the geopolitical tempest in Asia at that time. So, I mean, for me, the reason why I take that position is because, yes, on the one hand, there are many positions that I could claim allegiance to or that I come from. However, at the same time, I would like to be in a space where our positions are able to come together, you know, in such a way that we're not accusing each other. You know, we're not listening to each other so we can pick something out, you know, because actually we're in an art world together. You know, that's also something important to remember. And I think you touched on this, that actually this whole auteur thing and this idea of what the author is. I mean, for me, an author is not, like, for me personally, like, my authorship is I produce the conditions in which something can happen. That's enough for me. Do you know what I mean? And I think maybe what we've touched on now is the different ways in which people define words. Because for me, author is very different. You know, author is something that produces something that eventually goes out into the world, and the author dissolves because it becomes something else.
Andrew.
So thank you all so much. This was really fantastic. And Kimberly, you had quoted James Elkins, and when he said, you know, we need to do away with art history because of it is Eurocentric in and of itself. I really disagree, because unfortunately with that, it's just throwing up your hands and then
It's global. He means global, though.
Yeah, but Eurocentrism becomes the gatekeeper then of art history when you are simply saying, you know, we cannot participate in any meaningful way. And I think the work that you guys are doing and the questions that we're asking, those are the right questions. And I think that that's maybe a more productive conversation. It goes back to the question that you also asked yesterday on Clementine's panel, when you said, you know, when are these changes going to happen? Will it be in this lifetime? And I think this is really amazing, because it's showing that these changes are happening now.
Exactly.
And part of my frustration as well as a newer scholar is who's listening. And that's the frustrating thing, because sometimes it feels like we're yelling from the mountaintops, but who is actually getting the jobs? Who is getting the faculty positions? You know, and obviously these are uncomfortable discussions to have for some of us in the ivory towers, and for other of us waiting at the elevator downstairs, waiting to get up. But, you know, we still have all-white faculties that are incredibly Eurocentric and absolutely, and like, you know, you had Ming come, and she's again the only person of color in our department, and also the only post-colonial scholar. Like, there are all these problems in the art historical, the art market, and the university settings that we have. It's not necessarily the work is not being done, but it's how do we deal with the center-periphery in such a meaningful way that the periphery is not necessarily centered, but is a part of that discussion meaningfully.
Yeah. It's funny because I was talking to Kimberly about this yesterday, and I don't know how you guys feel, but I mean, I feel like I've been doing decolonial work from the minute I got into the art world, to be honest, because I mean, that's just how it's been. Like you said, you know, we all knew coming in what challenges were facing us in different ways. Everyone had different challenges, but, you know, at the end of the day, I feel like this is a great time. It's also our generation. It's, you know, the generations that are coming of age now, I think, have more fluency when it comes to this kind of complexity. You know, we don't have to be either or anymore, I think, you know. But like you said, yeah, absolutely. I feel like the work is being done, and I think I'm waiting for the time in which there's some kind of critical mass. Yeah.
You mean weight that has gone away from the center towards the many peripheries? What do you mean by critical mass?
Like, the idea of the global would become something more of a horizontal network in which all of our histories and all of our stories and experiences can be shared. And we don't have to be afraid of, I mean, not afraid, I mean, I think, what was it, George Lukács or something, or Ernst Bloch, you know, criticized the kind of jumble sale of art in like the mid-20th century or something, that it's like pick and choose whatever you want. Sure, that is actually a reality, but perhaps that actually offers us a very interesting possibility to think about how can we communicate across languages, how can we communicate across culture, how can we accept our differences, finally, and so we can stop talking about binaries, to be frank, because it's much more interesting to think about the process.
Or even with this, like, you know, again, planetary constellations metaphor, just because we were taught to see the Big Dipper doesn't mean that there aren't all these other stars. So I think it's really, hope is also a really important tool. And what for me is the most depressing thing about going to Guam is there's literally no hope. There's like one side, kill the Americans, there's the other side, like become an American. And that space for imagination isn't there. And I think that making these spaces for imagination, it sounds very utopic and fluffy, but it's really important.
We have a question in the back.
Okay, maybe it's not exactly a question, but one comment. I'm doing my PhD in Venice in art history, and it's very interesting that here today, this morning, we are talking about rewriting art history. But for me, it seems that the unique strategy that have been proposed and talked about is this one related to decolonial or post-colonial. But I have one example of my PhD program, and we are 5, and we are studying Venice Biennale, one for China, Brazil, Argentina, and I am from Mozambique, and one for Italy. And we are studying Venice Biennale, and we have started the same year. One very interesting thing that I think is good is that we focus much on the methods of studying, and that is bring very good connections in conversations between us, and also the way the others seeing the art histories for different parts that one is doing. For example, I'm using a lot social network analysis, and I started with ground theory, and I'm come up with very interesting results that put everything inside. And for example, regarding the publication or attending conference, that I think that is very good, because for example, if the methods that one is using is very, very interesting, one can go around or be able to publish in different types of journals, not only on the journals related to post-colonial studies or decolonial studies. So I think the challenge here is not rewriting, but is also the frame that is being using to rewrite this history. Yeah. Because if you are just looking for one frame, for example, I had at the beginning 2 supervisors, and one supervisor of mine was pushing me to do my research only on the post-colonial perspective. But I was not so, because I'm come from sociology, and I know that the methods matter, and also I'm strongly influenced on archaeology of knowledge, not just pick up the concept, but also be able to understand where this concept come from, and do this, all these connections. And I think create new connections can be also a type of creating new knowledge, new interpretation. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. How much time do we have, Hildegund? 8 minutes still. Mo.
So this is.
Oop.
Okay, so this is also maybe not so much of a question, but you can pick it up, and also maybe this is a response to Andrew, and that is like, this process it takes time, right? Like, you can't gun down tenured faculty to replace them with others, right? So the question is like, persistence, right? And to take us back to the question of art history, which is actually a philosophical question about what is history, right? And the old idea of history would be like history is buried underground, and the job of the historian is to like dig, find the history, bring it to light, and show it to people, right? Sort of like a time capsule. Then we had like the upgrade with sort of like a Benjaminian type of history, which is history is looking at the ruins of the past and trying to reconfigure it for the use of the present, right? But another way, and a more new way to look at history is look at history, and this sort of like relates to the keynote very much. History as a site of struggle of different futures in present. So different futures are already fighting for viability in the future in present using material from the past, right? So this is why it's very important to keep, not to keep like who's going to get hired tomorrow in sight, but how our struggle against different futures in present for viability will impact which one of these futures will be more dominant as time progresses. So it's a really lengthy and you know, the people on the wrong side are better at this than people on the right side. The right-wing people are much better at understanding how this works. How to plan futures.
I mean, I agree. This is definitely a long game, and actually a lot of it does have to do. I mean, we know this. I mean, a lot of this right now, the work that we're doing is going back into history to make sure history is actually adequately represented in its full complexity.
For a type of future we want.
Yeah, and for me, that's that is a given. That is a basic equation. History to future. In the middle, that's where we are. You could say that in the middle we find ourselves in binaries, but the middle space between us is also an important space. It's always that middle ground, actually, that I find very, very important to defend these days, actually.
Do we have any other questions? Okay. I think we could stop. Thank you, all of the panelists. Thank you so very much for your presentations. Thank you, audience, for participating.